I thank you for your concern, Elder Sahan, but the situation has already been resolved. Chieftain Arius was already moved away from Metzacan, and there is no chance for him to interact with your people there, which means that no conflict can arise from the situation. However, as I also said, I simply cannot recall him from his current post without compelling reason to do so. I know you had your differences, but right now we are all fighting on the same side, so please, let us drop this topic, at least until our current conflict is resolved, alright? Now please, do not let me keep you. I am sure you are eager to return to a bit more pleasant environments, Elder Sahan. It has been an honor to welcome you here. Well, that could have gone better. I should keep an eye on Kuzanev from now on, as it seems they won't easily forget nor forgive that business with Youngbloods. Ah, Mr. Storm, please come in. There's no need to wait outside.
You were busy with the envoy, Your Highness, and I didn't want to intrude.
You know full well that you never intrude. If anything, your presence here would have made me a lot more comfortable during that conversation. Some of these catfolk can be mighty intimidating even without trying.
They can indeed be very vicious when they want to, but it is also clear that they respect strength, and not only that, they also seem capable of realizing that it comes not only from physical or military might. I believe that with proper oversight they can become truly indisposable allies. Especially since, unlike most of our people, they don't seem bothered by scorching conditions in these islands. If anything, they even seem to enjoy them.
Good, but at the same time that means they won't be much use against Frostlings. Still though, you are right, they will certainly come in handy.
Let us hope so. But speaking of Frostlings, I actually wanted to talk about them, about that war we have just started. It's been on my mind ever since we received reports about that large confederation of tribes living in the west. I'll be honest with you, Your Highness, I do not think that this conflict is a good idea.
You don't? Of the two of us, you are the one who faced them before during the rebellion, and considering all that you have lost, what everyone on the continent have lost, I thought you'd be happy to settle the score.
I thought so too. For a long time I thought that wiping out the Frostlings is the only way to deal with them, but now I am not so sure. These ones living here are different, peaceful, or at the very least they don't seem to go around looking for trouble, at least some of them. We've been fighting them ever since they first appeared, but we never really tried to understand why they were fighting against us. Now, perhaps we have a chance to do that. More than that, so many people died already in conflicts against them. I can't stand to think about so many more who will perish in that coming war.
I agree with you, Mr. Storm. I really, truly do. And I do hope that they will have the common sense to surrender before we are forced to eradicate them. But at the same time, we need a victory. A single event that people can rally to. Simply put, if we want to fix Metzacan, then we need this war.
What are you saying, Your Highness? Are you telling me that you agreed to this idea of war? War in which thousands upon thousands of people will inevitably die to fix Metzacan? What do you even mean by that?
Solving our problems, Mr. Storm. All of them in a single go. And not just colonial ones, but those back home as well. I know it doesn't sound like a good reason to start a war, but I need you to trust me. The plan has already been set in motion. Now all we have to do is keep to it, and one day soon everything will be well again. And now it seems I have a call from Chieftain Arius, as if dealing with one angry cat wasn't enough already. So please excuse me for a moment. This is Arius Erigen, Chieftain. What's the word?
Apologies, sir, but Chieftain Arius is not present. He has delegated me to deal with any communication using our drones. Lieutenant Weiss, 1st Brigade of Steel Legion, at your service.
Good to hear from you then, Lieutenant. But is there any reason for this change in communication procedure?
Well, for one, our ward chief is not really willing to talk through drones, sir. Says that he has no idea if the person he's talking to is really you, so he would rather speak in person to avoid being tricked by a machine.
I see. That would explain why they're willing to travel around so much to discuss things instead of just sending a letter. And what's the other reason?
It's because the chieftain went out to scout enemy positions, sir. It looks like we'll be heading out into battle in a moment. As per your orders, we linked up with the elves of that independent settlement to provide them with any assistance they needed. But it seems we're not the only guests here. Apparently a bunch of religious fanatics from the Empire showed up in the area a few weeks back and started causing trouble. So much, in fact, that the elves asked us to deal with them. At first we wanted to decline, since no one would believe that a bunch of pilgrims could cause any trouble, not to mention that attacking Imperial citizens is never a good idea. But then our patrols ran into some of them. Seems this group is not all that interested in peaceful conversions, and would rather just kill all unbelievers in their way. And they really are as aggressive and dangerous as our kinsman described.
And just how dangerous a bunch of rock worshippers can be, Lieutenant?
A lot, sir. They may not be the best soldiers around, and they're clearly disorganized, but it doesn't matter, not when their magic rock seems to be protecting them. I know it sounds crazy, but I have seen it with my own eyes. One of our scouts shot an arrow directly into the eye of one of those fanatics, and the bastard just pulled it out and continued on as if nothing happened.
Maybe he missed by a few millimeters? Maybe that zealot was high on something. I'm pretty sure there are at least a dozen of substances available of these islands that could get someone into clouds so much they wouldn't notice if they lost all of their limbs. There must be some reasonable answer there, Lieutenant, but do keep me updated on the matter. And in the meantime, I will contact the capital and tell civic guardsmen to go to the Azure Temple and ask some questions around. Last thing we need here are immortal zealots. When 1st Brigade of Metzacan Still Legion disembarked onto cold, snow-covered island west of Surcaris, its soldiers and operators were ready for combat. For some, it would not be their first fight, as many elves already served in Metzacan forces before, albeit their numbers were overshadowed by humans. For most, however, this landing operation was supposed to be a first taste of war, easy one to ensure that their new recruits would not lose their morale in their very first engagement. And so, instead of being sent towards Berneth, where Arius and main colonial force already mopped up all remaining Frostlings, the Steel Legion, under command of Chieftain Arius, was sent to land near Rithile, that large, independent elven town, and provide assistance with whatever the locals may needed help with. It was supposed to be a simple operation. Get ashore, link up with the elves, maybe take down some Frostling hunters skulking in the woods, nothing special. Reality, however, rarely follows plans laid out by military commanders, and so even before the elves landed, they were contacted by leaders of Rithile, who brought to their attention a certain problem. Namely, a band of fanatical followers of Azure Heart, who seemingly arrived from the north, walking across frozen forests and hills, and as soon as they reached outlying elven villages, started rampaging around, killing farmers and hunters, or forcing them to join their ragtag zealous procession. It was an odd occurrence in itself. After all, up until now, worshippers of Skyshard were always peaceful, and so the sudden, violent crusade this one band embarked on came as even more of a surprise, especially since no one could tell what prompted it. Still, the danger was real, and so local mayor sent out several scouts to investigate the disturbance, and when they returned and relayed their report, situation quickly turned from curious to dangerous. Although that doesn't mean that this band of zealots was not interesting, far from it. For one, it was not led by men, but by a bunch of small, floating, cherub-like creatures that, upon closer examination, turn out to be magical constructs made out of stone, somehow animated with unknown magic. Armed with small bows, they were not exactly all that dangerous, but as scouts quickly realized, they were very similar to Metzacan drones, small, flying entities capable of scouting ahead of the main formation and relay data to the main force, although how exactly they were able to do that no one could really tell, as magic that fueled these beings was unlike anything Metzacans have ever seen. Then, the fanatics themselves were old as well, though perhaps that goes without saying. Composed mostly out of Imperial dwarves and greenskins, they formed a chaotic band, poorly organized and almost completely unequipped for any kind of prolonged operation. In fact, large number of them marched across snowy fields dressed only in loincloths, without even shoes to protect them from dreaded frostlands. And yet, despite that, they marched on as if nothing was wrong, with the weather itself barely having any effect on them, while their crude weapons were more than enough to deal with farmers and hunters. All that, however, was but a small, insignificant detail when compared to the last peace information Elven scouts gathered, one that made everyone in Metzaca wonder just what exactly was the deal with this increasingly popular religion. After all, amongst other races, even elves, religious beliefs were mostly minor rituals imposed ages ago by ancestors and held no divine power themselves, especially amongst followers of the Star Cult who didn't actually believe in gods. But followers of Azure Hearts apparently truly were protected by their deity, to the point that it made entire groups of warriors question their mettle in combat, while scholars from across the world scratched their heads in utter confusion. For, to put it bluntly, these zealots would not die. You could run them through with a blade, shoot them in the head with a musket, ride them down with cavalry, and yet they were still standing. It sounded like madness at first, but with the same report repeated over and over by dozens of scout teams, soon elves of this island had to accept the truth, and as they did so, they immediately contacted approaching Metzacan force and asked for their help, which Chieftain Arius was more than eager to provide. Sadly though, things did not exactly work out as they should have. Sudden change of wind forced Metzacan transport ships to land further to the east than they planned, which gave the Zealots, who must have been observing the entire situation from afar, a chance to close in on the Steel Legion before it could link up with local elves. Fortunately, colonials had enough time to unload all of their equipment ashore, but as soon as they did so, both elves, Tigrans and machines were forced to rush ahead deeper inland to avoid being caught in the open on the beach. To Chieftain Arius, this was a chance to prove his mettle. His foes were similar in number to his own force, but at the same time they were poorly equipped, and so he, like everyone else, believed that victory was simply a matter of marching forward and killing everyone in the way. Truth, however, once again proved to be a bit more problematic, for, as was said, these fanatics were more than capable of holding their own in a fight, simply because, as was reported, no matter how hard you'd strike them, they would not die. Although at first, no one really believed that, and the report was discarded as ramblings of some incompetent archers, too prideful to admit their own failures, and so Steel Legion marched into combat with high hopes and few reservations. When two groups finally met, longbowmen from Surcaris were the first to strike, launching several deadly volleys of arrows at approaching mob, although sadly their effect was reduced by trees that grew densely in the area. In the meantime, automatons, gunners and engineers marched on ahead to secure a good position where they could hold their ground, and there, finally, they have seen their enemies. A half-naked horde of goblins, orcs and dwarves emerged from amongst the trees, chanting some unknown song, while just ahead of them a group of winged, cherub-like constructs rushed on ahead and fired their small bows at oncoming foes, although against elven automatons such attacks barely had any effect. Expecting this encounter to be over within moments, operators raised weapons on their machines, while behind them, a group of musketeers launched a devastating volley into an approaching crowd. But when smoke from that volley cleared out, instead of seeing a heap of corpses riddled with bullets, elves of Surcaris saw the very same mob still charging towards them, completely unperturbed by this attack. Confused, the gunners reloaded and fired again, but once more their bullets had no effect. Upon seeing this, Chieftain Arius ordered automaton crews to prepare for attack and himself rallied his Tigran retinues to prepare a flanking move, but in that moment the lines clashed. The zealots, wielding massive sledgehammers and scythe-like polearms, rushed into automatons without fear, swinging their weapons around with wild abandon. The automatons responded by forming a shield wall and welcoming the approaching mob with powerful thrusts of their spears, but just like with musket rounds, these attacks seemed to have no effect whatsoever. The zealots simply shrugged any attack off, backed away, and then, mere seconds later, rushed back into the fray with their wounds already closed. It was enough to cause panic in the ranks of Steel Legion. Suddenly, their first assignment turned out to be a lot more difficult than they thought, and now, with the zealots slowly surrounding them, any hopes of surviving the day became smaller with every moment. Only Chieftain Arius' sharp commands kept his soldiers in line, but even he must have been more than little stressed out by the situation, especially when he saw just how badly the fight was going. The weapons of his foes might have been crude and their wielders untrained, but since they didn't have to worry about their own self-preservation, they could simply swing them around wildly to deal as much damage as possible, and not even elven automatons were able to survive being repeatedly bashed with dozens of sledgehammers. Behind, a group of engineers witnessed this entire madness, panicked, and started throwing flash bombs all around, blinding everyone on both sides, something that ultimately proved more devastating to Metzacans than to their foes. Even longbowmen, theoretically safe behind the lines, were suffering, for many of the fanatics carried slings with them, which they now used to drown elven archers with a relentless hailstorm of rocks. The situation looked decidedly bad, and when Chieftain Arius spotted another group of foes rushing towards them, he barely suppressed the urge to flee. Instead, he picked up one of his small throwing blades and, with all his might, threw it into enemy formation, directly into the throat of the leading zealot, who simply pulled it out and continued on. Arius, however, was not looking at him but beyond, to back lines, where he spotted something that would turn this fight around. The zealot might have been all fine and well, but in the very same moment when he was struck, another one, further behind the lines, suddenly dropped dead to the ground, his throat gushing with blood spewing in all directions. This was it. Through some deranged magical trick, these backline warriors were capable of transferring wounds of their frontline combatants onto themselves, but they could clearly not do so for long, and as the battle progressed, even though zealots on the line remained standing, their comrades in the back dropped to the ground with increasing frequency. Upon seeing that, Arius relayed his discovery to the rest of his troops, who now had even more incentive to hold their ground as their commander walked his way around the flank to deal with those support troops. A group of Cherubs trying to stop them, but were no match for combined might of Tigran riders and elven gunners, and soon Arius and his retinues descended upon enemy back lines, slashing their foes left and right. These martyrs, however, barely defended themselves, already bloodied and beaten due to wounds taken by their comrades at the front, and within few moments, the last one of these mysterious fanatics fell to the ground, to a cheer coming from the direction of the main fight. With their support gone, the zealots started to drop like flies, but even that did not douse their fiery resolve, and when the battle was finally over a few moments later, almost everyone on the field was either dead or wounded. The automatons lied in a heap, broken apart by hammers, while elven soldiers limped towards the camp carrying wounded behind them, but at the same time they also left many of their comrades in the snow, for by now they were beyond any help. Even Chieftain Arius, though victorious, was barely standing on his feet as well, and almost all of his retinues were either dead or wounded. But the zealots were all dead as well, every last one of them, and so message was sent to Elven Town nearby, in which colonial forces asked for medical assistance and reinforcements. Fortunately, citizens of Rithila were more than grateful, and so quickly provided whatever assistance they could offer, including a company of heavily armed and armored swordsmen who would replace losses taken by the elves from Surkaris. But even though victory was achieved and Rithila leaders decided to officially become part of Metzaca thanks to it, when news about the fight reached Prince Arius, he was not exactly thrilled. The Steel Legion was supposed to be his secret weapon in this war. Instead, it got almost completely wiped out by a bunch of half-naked, mindless zealots, and the sheer cost of replenishing its numbers and fixing the automatons would put a serious dent in Metzacan coffers, not to mention that it would take time that could be used to move towards main Frostling Spire. Most importantly though, Metzacan's secret weapon turned out to be weaker than expected, and that certainly boded poorly for any future encounter. And more fights were most certainly on the horizon, although because of the losses taken by automatons, who were supposed to spearhead invasion of Frostling heartlands, the main offensive had to be put on hold, at least until the machines and casualties were replaced. In the meantime, however, Metzacans would not just leave their enemies alone, and mere few days after news about battle against religious zealots reached Prince Arius, he used his authority as Lord Governor to rally entirety of colonial fleet in order to send them at their foes. And said fleet was, by now, certainly worthy of that name. Thanks to economic boom and technological improvements, Metzacan shipyards were finally capable of producing truly modern warships, and over the past year, 6 of them were finished in various ports across the islands. In Metzaca itself, artificer shipwrights poured all of their knowledge into constructing man-o'-wars, hulking capital ships lined with rows and rows of heavy coronet cannons that could completely drown all nearby enemies in a hailstorm of fire. It seriously reduced their range though, but these ships were designed specifically to fight up close, preferably opening the fight by ramming whatever foe was in front of them, following it with a barrage of cannon fire, and then finishing whatever enemy was left standing with musket volleys. It was, of course, quite a dangerous endeavor, but at the same time these warships were built with best available materials and reinforced with best steel, to make sure that they would be able to pull off their assaults without trouble. Following these flagships were 2 regular galleons built in shipyards of Fringid. These vessels were regular, mostly unremarkable models similar to ones used by fleets all across the world, and were pretty much larger, slower and more dangerous cousins of regular frigates. The main difference, however, was in their armaments, as ballistae on board were replaced by a battery of cannons that gave these galleons an ability to engage its foes at a respectable range, and even if some enemy would dare to come closer, the crew could always deter them with flaming arrows, or, if that failed, simply resort to old-fashioned ramming. And finally, from cold dockyards of Surcaris came 2 Stormbreakers, pride of Elven nautical engineering. These warships were built in a similar style to human galleons, but slightly longer and sleeker, which gave them better maneuverability. Instead of being equipped with cannons, however, these Stormbreakers were lined up with ballistae, with some of them even being placed in rotating turrets at the front and back of the ship, which greatly increased its firepower, and worked well to complement guns placed on man-o'-wars and galleons. For while human warships needed a while to reload their weapons, their elven comrades could keep any foes at bay in the meantime by steady barrage of bolts that, thanks to ingenuity of their artificers, now carried electric charges with them, something designed specifically to deal as much damage as possible to sea dwellers. Ultimately, this new heavy fleet was certainly a sight to behold, and as it finally gathered in one place, it became, quite possibly, the most powerful naval force on the entire archipelago. But of course, these ships were not just built to look menacing, and as soon as they were ready, they sailed west to link with Commodore Yarohin's fleet and Metzacan artillery brigade in one of colonial outlying naval bases. Until now, the light fleet of frigates and cruisers was mostly occupied with patrolling the trade lanes and keeping inhabitants of the sea at bay, but now, with support of an airship full of cannons and their new heavy fleet, colonial forces were more than a match for anything the wave dwellers could muster, and so, under orders of Prince Arius, they prepared to sail west and seize the settlement where Tritons and mermaids collaborated with their Frostling enemies. Obviously though, the fleet would not simply sail into the fray without any scouting, and so yet another wave of drones was sent to the half-sunken settlement to find out just what exactly was lurking there. And while their mission was, technically speaking, a success, the truth was that the sea dwellers were more than prepared to receive any unwelcome guests, and as soon as the drones were spotted, flying low above the waves boiled and a group of Tritons rushed forth to intercept them. and though said tritons were certainly not pushovers, as they were similar in size to Nagas, and therefore almost twice as tall as an average human, it was their pets that truly gave operators of the drones a real scare. For the merfolk had with them an actual, fully grown kraken, a massive octopus-like beast larger even than Metzacan warships. What's more, the beast was covered in various old scars, which meant that it was old, and if it survived to this age, it must have been dangerous. Something that drone operators learned with terrifying clarity as soon as the beast broke through the surface and lunged at their machines. Flailing its tentacles around, it could easily reach even those drones that fly high above it and knock them out of the sky without any troubles. It was, of course, pretty much exactly what their operators wanted though, but even as their machines self-destructed in a cloud of flames and shrapnel, their explosive deaths had barely any effect on the monster, that simply shrugged it off. Within a few minutes, an entire cloud of flying machine was taken out, and the only thing they managed to achieve was taking down some of the tritons and scorching their hide on the kraken. It certainly felt it, but it did nothing to slow it down. The fleet, however, was already on its way, and even though Commodore Yarohin was not even remotely pleased with the sheer power of his foes, he was determined to carry out the attack anyway. Sure, the drones might have failed to cause any significant damage, but they still performed their task as best as they could, and so giving the merfolk any time to rest would be a waste. And so, mere few seconds after last of the machines disappeared in a fireball, Sea Dwellers noticed yet another danger charging towards them, an entire Metzacan fleet, backed up by an ominous shape floating right above them. It was time for Colonial Navy to prove its mettle, but as its crews would very soon learn, the merfolk were not willing to back down so easily. After all, they had a lot to lose, and so when the fleet was spotted, an entire horde of Sea Dwellers rushed to meet it, and they were not alone. Amongst tritons and sea monsters, one could see a contingent of Frostlings that was present in the surface part of this nearly sunken city at all times. Were they overlords or simply envoys, no one could tell, but at this point all that mattered was that they moved towards colonial ships themselves, clearly with hostile intentions, backed by their vicious penguins and elementals. Still, despite all that, situation seemed rather one-sided, and Metzacan crews prepared themselves for a hard-fought but certain victory. But in that very moment, the weather itself turned against them. As the ships closed the distance between their foes and prepared to fire first broadsides, the sky above them darkened, and mere minutes later an entire ocean was struck by a massive thunderstorm that rocked the ships around, throwing gunners off their targets. What's worse, seconds after first drops of water fell down, the clouds above exploded with violent thunder strikes that immediately set some of the vessels on fire, though fortunately the rain itself dealt with that problem before it got out of hand. But while naval crews managed to remain in control of their ships, the airship that transported colonial artillery fared far, far worse. Constantly struck by lightning and battered around by heavy winds, the crew barely managed to prevent their machine from falling into the ocean, but in doing so, they were thrown way off course, directly towards toughest Triton warriors and their pet Kraken. What's worse, damage caused by lightning forced the airship to move barely few meters above the waves, and while it gave the gun crews a chance to fire their weapons at approaching beasts, it also gave merfolk an opportunity to attack the airship itself, and soon first harpoons were thrown at its sides, with Sea Dwellers already climbing ropes attached to them. Not that it would make their attack any easier though, for as they climbed up they were constantly repelled by the crew on board, that fired their blunderbusses at anything that tried to board their ship. Even when some of the merfolk managed to get on deck, most of them were immediately torn apart by golems, who were also on board and now fought tooth and nail to keep their ship flying, for it was the only thing standing between them and ocean waves, and as advanced as these war constructs were, swimming was not one of their abilities. But while the airship struggled, the main fleet performed its task swiftly and efficiently, despite weather itself working against them. First groups of approaching Frostlings, merfolk and monsters were already wiped out by relentless cannon fire, and colonial captains could now focus their attention on moving towards their airborne comrades. Some foes still stood in their way though, including a small group of Frostling longboats and a company of flying cavalry, but between cannons, arrows, rams and ballista bolts, these enemies were quickly wiped out, leaving only Triton elites, and, of course, their Kraken. Also everyone thought, for as attention of the fleet was focused on these great foes, a group of elementals slipped into the clouds and then, when no one expected it, rushed down, smashing their bodies into one of Metzacan galleons. What's worse, the creatures were seemingly capable of carrying static electricity within themselves, and so as they came down they did so with the power of a dozen lightning strikes, so powerful that the galleon simply exploded as this devastating energy reached its powder stores. But that was just the start of Metzacan problems, for mere seconds later a writhing mass of tentacles broke through the water below airship and, with a single mighty swing, smashed it apart. The balloon that held it in the air deflated, and the entire contraption, now in two pieces, barreled into crashing waves beneath it. Cannons, weapons and men vanished beneath the surface immediately, but some of the engineers, those who decided to not wear their heavy armor, managed to hold on to floating bits of their rapidly sinking vessel, but were quickly overrun as Triton warriors rushed over them. Some of the golems and their operators survived as well, holding on to various still floating pieces of their ship, frantically waving their arms around at anything that came closer. The slaughter of the 1st Artillery Brigade would have been complete, if not for the fact that the merfolk were not given a chance to hunt their enemies down. For as soon as the airship fell, Commodore Yarohin gave his men an order to move towards the crash site and fire everything they had at the Sea Dwellers to get their attention and, hopefully, buy the survivors some time to swim away. Although, in such a violent thunderstorm and with Kraken still on the loose, that proposition was just as dangerous as staying on the wrecked airship. Nonetheless, that was the only option right now, and so colonial warships darted forward across the waves, with one of the man-o'-wars even sent to ram the Kraken, a potentially suicidal plan, but it was the only chance to give the gun crews a chance to survive. Despite all that destruction, however, things started to look up for colonial forces, whose numbers, as expected, were more than enough to counter merfolk natural affinity for fighting in the sea. The sunken city echoed with thunderous explosions, and broadside after broadside was unloaded into sea dwellers, ripping through their ranks with ease. The Tritons and other denizens of the oceans might have been stronger and more resilient than humans, elves or other civilized races, but when shot by artillery, they fell just like everyone else. Even the mighty Kraken, pounded with hundreds of cannon and musket rounds and pierced by a ram, was forced to submit, and finally, after long struggle, it was brought down by a close-range broadside from the same man-o'-war that rammed it moments before. Spurting fountains of black blood from dozens of wounds, it thrashed one last time, trying to drag the offending vessel down with it, but in that moment a cannon round pierced through its skull, and the creature slammed back into the waves, only to re-emerge moments later, a few meters away as a tangled, floating corpse. Upon seeing that, the last remaining Tritons gathered for a last stand, but Commodore Yarohin was not going to give them even a slightest chance of fighting back, just like they didn't give sinking artillery crews any chance as well. And so, in a last maneuver of this battle, entire Metzacan fleet rushed forward, using heavy winds of the storm to their advantage, and rammed the last remaining Triton group, while firing their weapons at anything that moved among the waves. The assault on the sunken city was successful. All defenders, whether merfolk or frostlings, were either dead or dying, and colonial crews cheered their victory, and then immediately turned their ships around to look for survivors. And while they managed to recover some of the men from the lost airship, the truth was that 1st Artillery Brigade was completely and fully taken out of the action. Their guns, ammunition and equipment and most of their crews were at the bottom of the ocean, and even ghoul divers would not be able to recover them. A handful of golems that survived the first crash sank by now as well, and only their operators still floated on the waves, both scared and elated that they managed to survive. The fleet took quite significant losses as well, but only one of their warships was destroyed, and so it was still ready for action. An action they would see, although not of the kind they might have expected. For as the sea calmed down, more merfolk were spotted among the waves, moving towards the fleet. But these ones were not warriors, and to make sure everyone was aware of that, they carried with them a white flag, an unmistakable sign of their capitulation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the plan for our assault on Frostling Main Spire. I am aware that it's not perfect, but with support of our siege artillery, we should be able to force our enemies to leave their defenses and come to face us in the open. And if they decide to remain on their walls, we'll be able to simply bombard them from afar, and then send our golems and automatons to mop up any resistance. Now then, all that we have to do is wait for news from Commodore Yarohin. Until then, you are dismissed. Get back to your men and get them organized. Now then, what is taking him so long? With such advantage, our fleet should be able to... Ah, finally! Commodore, it's good to see you. Please tell me you're bringing good news. We have won a victory, Lord Governor, but it did not go exactly according to plan. Thank you, Commodore. I am sure you have done your best, and despite all these losses, you still managed to achieve victory. That is commendable. But I have to say, screw formalities. The loss of the airship and artillery will make our job here on land a lot harder. At least you managed to recover the crews. Some of them, at least. Those vests artificers made kept our people afloat after the airship went down, but they did not help them against all the sea creatures, not to mention that all of the guns and golems are at the bottom of the sea now. I already ordered our ghoul diver teams to try and recover them, but this operation will require a lot more people. So, that battle could have gone a lot worse. Indeed. And in the end you have won, which should make our trade routes a lot more safer. From your reports, I would assume it will be years, maybe even decades before the merfolk will be able to organize another strike force. I don't think we should worry about it, Lord Governor. If the info provided by the ones we rounded up is true, then we have just eliminated their last settlement. There may be some outlying tribes left, but as far as their civilization goes, we're in control of the last enclave. Are we now? How can you be sure? I can't know with certainty, but all of the remaining merfolk are saying the same thing, that this is their last city. They've been hunted for centuries now, and for the most part we all believe they were gone. After Emerald Fleet wiped their enclaves near the old continent, only a handful managed to flee here, and it seems they have not recovered well. Hard to even call them a civilization now, and it seems that in this fight we have killed their last remaining warriors, except for a small detachment that was sent to the Frostlings Spire. Ah yes, I've been wondering about that. Have you learned why they decided to ally themselves with Cold Ones? I would think that their idea of turning oceans into ice would not sit well with them. And it doesn't, but they were out of options. The Frostlings apparently not only provided them with much-needed supplies to help with rebuilding, in recent years they also kept Cridian and Imperial Corsairs away from them. In exchange, they wanted merfolk help with excavating several underwater ruins, although no one can tell what exactly they were looking for. The Cold Ones simply gathered every single artifact from these ruins, though for some reason they were not all that interested in gold. Good. Last thing we need are rich Frostlings. Knowing economic situation on the continent, you can bet some fools would try working for them, just like some mercenaries worked for the Archmage. Still though, now we have some answers, though admittedly also a lot more questions. Still, are you completely sure that the Sea Dwellers don't have other armies or underwater fortresses hidden somewhere? I can't be sure, but at the same time I have no reason to doubt their words. I sent ghouls to the bottom of this city to look for eventual stragglers, but they found nothing. According to their reports, these underwater lairs are extremely limited, and I can see for myself that many of the merfolk look weak and malnourished. Not to mention that, if they had any other place to run to, they would probably do so, instead of surrendering to us and placing themselves at our mercy. As they said, some smaller renegade tribes may still lurk out there, but by now they shouldn't pose any serious threat. They're pretty much wild at this point. I see. That is good to know. So am I correct to assume that you have all the Sea Dwellers gathered up in one place, and that the only remaining warriors are in the spire we are currently marching towards? Good. Then I want you to round up all of the remaining fishmen and place them in a secured area. And then kill every last one of them. What? Kid, you can't be serious. I just told you they have surrendered to us. Don't you think they could be put to use to walk off all the damage they caused? We're talking about beings that have complete mastery of the seas. Just think what we could achieve with their help. No pirate would ever touch our trade ships. No hostile fleet would dare to contest our warships. We could dominate every body of water, from lakes to oceans, with their help. No, Commodore. The merfolk would dominate them. How do you think we could enforce our will on a race that can live beneath the waves? Even more so, if we gave them a chance to rebuild, what would stop them from turning on us? I believe that this is precisely what they are planning, to use us while they are weak, gather their strength, and then, when we are reliant on their support, break away, placing this entire archipelago at their mercy. We can't know that, Arius. Can't we? Was there ever any situation where Sea Dwellers did something good for our people? No, all they did was raid our coasts and sink our merchants. Our ancestors spent hundreds of years and hundreds of thousands of lives trying to put an end to their savagery, and now, finally, we have a chance to finish what they started. If we allow them to survive and rebuild, then all their sacrifices were for nothing. All these men who died today died for nothing. We can't afford to not be thorough now, Commodore. You're right, kid. But even though you are right, this is still wrong. You're asking me to commit genocide. I do, Admiral Yarohin, but at the same time know that I will take full responsibility for it. I will send you a signed order right away, as well as several copies to the Council, archivists and embassies of other nations. I'm not going to skulk in the shadows like a common murderer or pretend I had nothing to do with it. This is my decision as Lord Governor of Metzacan. If bringing safety and security to my people means that I have to give such an atrocious order, then so be it. The conquest of last true merfolk city was recorded in history as Battle of Red Waves, due to heavy casualties taken by both sides. But even though hundreds of soldiers, warriors and beasts perished during the storm, their blood was nowhere near enough to turn the ocean red. The blood of remaining merfolk, however, was, and as remaining population surrendered, no doubt in hopes of preserving their last outposts, denizens of the oceans realized that Metzacan fleet would not allow them to survive. On the orders of Lord Governor himself, entire population of the city, or at least the part that could be found, was rounded up, gathered on various small islands and rocks around the area, and then executed with cold, merciless efficiency. Old, young, healthy, wounded, strong or weak, intelligent or simple beasts, the Sea Dwellers were all shot, and no amount of begging or bargaining could save them. The fleet surrounded the entire area and, with support of ghouls who could operate underwater, found every single hiding spot and either dragged merfolk hiding there to the surface or simply obliterate them by dropping weight gunpowder barrels into the sea and detonating them whenever they reached hiding spots. It was, of course, not a process that could be finished within a day, and over the next 2 months, fleet of newly promoted Admiral Yarohin had their hands full. Cannons echoed day and night, and in between their thundering strikes one could hear the endless, low thumping sound of depth charges that, after last of the hiding spots was destroyed, were turned against merfolk spawning pools deep at the bottom of the sea, where their eggs and newborn were reduced into red mist that slowly raced to ocean's surface. Meanwhile, ghoul sailors scavenged whatever they could find, and the place certainly was filled with tremendous amount of treasure, from gold stolen from sunken ships to ancient artifacts excavated from other ruins. It was to be a very profitable venture for Metzacan Navy, one that would cover the cost of lost artillery brigades several times over. It would also be a very profitable endeavor for the colony itself as well, for as merfolk numbers were culled so drastically, safety of trade routes was bound to increase, which would no doubt convince even more traders to move their businesses to Archipelago. Overall, all these visions of even greater fortunes appearing on the horizon meant that the fate of Sea Dwellers was mostly overlooked or outright ignored. Some, of course, lamented such a barbaric treatment of these beings, but their voices were few and far between. If anything, Metzacan Navy was now being hailed as a force that finished a long war that surface nations fought with the seaborne enemies for at least several centuries now. It did not mean the complete end of Sea Dwellers though, as some without a doubt managed to escape the carnage, while some smaller tribes were still reported to live amongst the islands. But with the loss of their last administrative center and last vestiges of their civilization, they would not remain a threat for long. They would either be found and hunted down to the last one, or would try to slink into deepest, darkest reaches of the oceans in hopes of avoiding continental powers that would show no mercy to them. But whichever option they choose, their mastery over the oceans was no more. The waves were now ruled by the surface dwellers. The assault on the sunken city, however, was more than just a simple offensive operation or an act of vengeance. It was also part of Lord Governor's plan for this campaign against the Frostlings and, aside for one detail, it worked out exactly as it was meant to. First and foremost, it focused attention of the Cold Ones on the southern front. With colonial fleet rampaging across the waves there, it seemed obvious that Metzacans would try to consolidate all of their forces and attack from there. Instead, Arius, Mr. Storm, Chieftain Arius and Galadea took their forces from the freshly reconquered elven settlement, marched through the frozen forests and then, while their foes were occupied by Metzacan Navy, crossed the narrow strait between Elven Island and Frostling One, and landed on the northern edge of their enemy's territory, in a place where they were least expected, a maneuver that would not be possible if the merfolk patrolling the seas were not dealt with during Yarohin's attack. Using another patch of frozen forest as cover, Colonial Army managed to get all of their forces ashore without being spotted, and then quickly marched towards the central spire, hoping to surround and capture it before Cold Ones could rally reinforcements. It was there, however, when one part of the plan failed, as Arius hoped that by moving his fleet to attack the sunken city, merfolk in the frozen army would leave their allies and go protect their home. That, unfortunately, did not happen, and so the spire and surrounding city was far better defended than Metzacan commander wished, but there was little to be done about it. The loss of artillery would make this attack difficult without a doubt, but there was simply no time to lose, as any delay could give Cold Ones a chance to bring back more of their warriors, still busy fighting Crimson Company in the west. And so, even though it would not be easy, Metzacan force prepared for a siege assault, knowing full well that it would be a bloody and deadly affair, no matter how well executed. The army surrounded the town and, buffeted by freezing snowstorm that made even basic tasks like walking and breathing a dangerous affair, began preparing siege engines and ladders to scale the walls, while trebuchets and Arius's cannoneers started their own attack against Spire's fortifications. On the right flank, automatons of Steel Legion marched on forth, unbothered by sight of heavily defended walls, ready to break down the gate and, hopefully, allow the rest of the army in. For now, though, they were just to act as a distraction, while the rest of the army readied itself for attack. Few hours later, the war horns blared all across the line and, to an echoing barrage of cannons, colonial forces began advancing towards the walls, still invisible in the falling snow. And then, in a blink of an eye, the weather changed completely. Snow turned into freezing rain that turned to ice mere seconds after falling down, covering everything and everyone on the field in a cold layer of transparent ice that slowed movement and sapped strength of anyone caught in the open. Occasionally, rain turned into hailstorm, with fist-sized pieces of ice falling to the ground, wounding everyone on the field. Metzacan troops became exhausted even before they reached the walls, but now, at the very least, they could see them, and the sheer amount of enemies that awaited them there. Frostlings, Tritons, Elementals, even a cloud of fairies were waiting there, and now that they had colonial forces in the open right in front of them, they launched everything they could at approaching soldiers. The battle officially began, but as it did, Prince Arius and his mentor noticed something strange. A tall, robed figure stood at one of the bastions, its face hidden by white hood. The figure shouted something, but in the chaos no one could hear what it was, although some of the soldiers who then came back to camp reported that this Frostling apparently shouted at anyone nearby to stand down. What's weird though, it shouted these words not just at Metzacans, but at its own kin as well, and never responded to any attacks. It was a curious sight to be sure, but Mr. Storm, who through entire battle never left Arius' side, suddenly twitched in his saddle and said that this figure appeared to be similar to the one spotted by some of the scouts and marked as supposed ruler of these Frostlings. Information that made Metzacan artillery immediately target him with everything they got. However, before colonial cannons and trebuchets turned that frontal bastion into rubble, the figure retreated back into the walls, chased by several cannon rounds, much to dismay of gunners who hoped to demoralize their foes by taking their leader so early on in the fight. Instead, the siege raged on, and very quickly turned from an organized affair into complete, chaotic bloodbath impossible to control. Galadea's undead cohorts and elementals rushed forth, taking the brunt of enemy defensive fire, while all across the field companies of men slowly but surely made their way towards the walls. But as they did so, more and more of their numbers remained on the ground, pierced by harpoons, arrows, or killed by magical attacks. Gunners and archers shot everything they had at enemy that appeared on the top of the walls, but because of these fortifications, their attacks were not as useful as usual, especially when it came to musketeers, who could not arc their shots over the walls like archers could. Still, Metzacans did have several aces up their sleeves, mostly in form of Mr. Storm, whose magic thundered across the sky, knocking enemies down left and right, and opening opportunities for other troops to exploit. But Frostlings and their allies would not sell their skins lightly. With their backs against the wall, surrounded by Metzacan army, they fought with such ferocity that in many places colonial attack was repelled before it could even reach the walls. On the right, Steel Legion was intercepted by companies of Frostling Bull Riders and elite Triton warriors that were more than a match even for cold, steel-plated automatons. On the left, Metzacan infantrymen who were with Prince Arius ever since he arrived fell in droves, unable to climb the walls under a hailstorm of magical attacks launched by the defenders. And in the center, Galadea's shamblers were intercepted by hostile elementals while trying to climb the walls, and knocked back down in a heap of crumpled bones and rotting body parts. All across the wall, defenders managed to repel attack after attack, and only colonial artillery was able to actually cause any serious damage to them. What's worse, assault of the Steel Legion was halted so thoroughly that both elves and their commanders suddenly found themselves in a situation without a way out. Intercepted during their climb, they could not continue moving up, for the wolf riders waiting on the wall could wipe them out before invaders could form a foothold. And they could not fall back either, for the same wolf riders could then bombard them from the top of the wall with harpoons and rocks. The automatons themselves fared no better, for as they approached enemy gates, these suddenly were thrown open, and a company of old Triton warriors charged through it and locked machines from Surcaris in a deadly clash, in which both sides took tremendous casualties. Desperate, warriors of Steel Legion continued their assault anyway, if only in hopes of keeping their enemies occupied, but the Cold Ones had them completely at their mercy. Less than an hour later, a handful of bloodied, battered elves barely holding themselves upright limped back to camp and reported that their attack has failed and their comrades were almost completely annihilated. However, hope was not lost yet, for although Frozen Ones managed to take down Steel Legion, they had to pull their forces away from other sections of the walls to do so, and that gave Knights of the Trident a chance to push a battering ram all the way to enemy leftmost gate, break it down, and rush into the city, opening a way for other troops to follow, though by then most of them on that flank were already either dead or wounded. but even that sudden breach proved to be enough to drastically change the flow of battle, as both sides continued to fight each other in inconclusive but deadly grinds over the walls, but with support of their artillery, and Galadea herself, who once again threw herself into battle without any care for her own safety, Metzacan slowly but surely managed to push their enemies back and made their way into the city. Finally, when Wolven guards broke through the central gate and rushed in, swinging their axes at anyone and anything in their way, both sides realized that the battle was already over and colonial army seized the victory. Their frozen foes kept fighting on, however, but within next hour the last stronghold was captured, and before sunset, Metzacan flags waved all across the walls, while in the distance colonial cannons already fired upon the spire to bring it down. The remnants of Archmage's rebellion were no more. The city was captured, and remaining Frostlings were now at mercy of their conquerors, who already poured into the streets to loot whatever valuables they could find, except for Lord Governor Arius Erigen himself, who was nowhere to be found. I'm sorry, soldier. It shouldn't have gone this way. If anything, I should be the one lying here, the one responsible for this mess. Instead, here I stand, and the only thing I can do is ensure that your sacrifice will not be forgotten. I hope your next life under another star will be peaceful.
Your Highness! Your Highness, there you are! I've been looking all over the field for you. What are you doing here? It's not safe within the walls.
Apologies, Mr. Storm, but I can take care of myself, though I thank you for your concern. I came here because Lieutenant of the Wolven Guards said that they're missing some of their numbers, including their captain. They were last seen around this area, so after the battle was done I came here to investigate. But as you can see, I was too late.
It is a shame indeed, Your Highness. Still, you should not have just left the main force. The battle may be won, but the area, especially within the walls, is not safe. There are still some places where remnants of Frostling and Merfolk hold their ground.
I'm aware. I can still hear gunshots. But it was safe here, so no need to worry. Now then, we'll have to send someone here to recover the bodies, although with all the losses we took today it may take a while.
At least they won't start decomposing in this cold. I just wish there was something we could do, but it's too late now. I actually wanted to apologize for myself, Your Highness. My performance in this battle was...
Not another word, old friend. You did all you could, and so did everyone else. If anyone is to blame here, it's me for being determined to make this assault even with our limited artillery support, and so I will take responsibility for all deaths here today. Speaking of which, have you managed to find Chieftain Arius?
Not personally, but yes, though I'm afraid I do not bring good news. A remaining handful of his fellow Tigran warriors brought him back, but it was too late to do anything for him. The combination of cold and electricity was too much for his body, just like for most of his people. Truth be told, it was a miracle they reached so far, as they were clearly even less adapted to such freezing temperatures than we are.
That's what I kept telling him. Day after day I told him to go back to Sidiu and prepare his own people there, but he was determined to prove himself. Or maybe to repay us for keeping his people away from Kuzaner's elders. It's hard to say what these cats are thinking most of the time.
According to remnants of the Steel Legion, he truly gave his all in this fight. His flank might have been wiped out, but at least they kept a lot of enemies occupied and gave our other forces a chance to break through the walls in other areas. It's such a shame that they failed to even climb the walls, though. If they did, then maybe...
They did climb them, Mr. Storm, or at least Chieftain Arius did. As you said, he gave his all here today, so the least we can do is present his death as heroic one. We can tell his fellow Tigrans that he gave his life opening the way for our eventual victory. It won't bring him back, but maybe at least it'll make his death worthy of praise amongst his own kind. I don't know much about them, but they do seem to like their heroic tales about ancient warriors. Maybe one day Arius will have a legend of his own.
We can only hope, Your Highness.
Indeed. But still, all this death, all this slaughter. 1st Brigade of the Steel Legion is almost completely wiped out, and their machines turned into scrap metal. The Tigrans are gone, Hundreds of soldiers from Metzacan are gone, and it is all my fault because I was impatient. What the hell was I thinking?
You did what you had to do, Your Highness. There was no way for us to supply the army while waiting for another artillery brigade, so we would have been forced to retreat, and that would have given our enemies chance to rally even more troops, or maybe even launch a counterattack. Besides, the losses are not as bad as they could have been. Some companies may no longer be fit for action, true, but not all of these men are dead. Most of them can be brought back on their feet, either in hospitals or, in worst cases, as ghouls.
We still lost too many, Mr. Storm. But then again, I don't know how else this could have gone. Not with the weather itself fighting against us. Were those freezing storms common during the rebellion as well?
They were. And, if anything, they claimed more lives than Frostlings themselves. You think rain would not be as dangerous as snow, but not when lightning strikes you at every step, and not when said rain freezes mere seconds after reaching your skin. It saps strength more than freezing weapons of the cold ones, which leads to even greater casualties.
Well, with a bit of luck we will never see such weather again. Now then, enough distractions. We should be heading back. It's time for me to face my soldiers.
What are you going to tell them?
The truth. That this battle, though victorious, was a nightmare, but by enduring through it we have defeated a dangerous enemy and secured a safe position on this archipelago, for ourselves and for our loved ones. I will personally compensate any family that... Wait, Mr. Storm, look! There, this body. I think it's the Frostling we saw on the walls once, the one you thought was the leader.
It certainly seems so, Your Highness. By the looks of it, he was hit by artillery that tore a large part of his body off. Let me take a closer look. By the stars, this cannot be right. Your Highness, I know this man. His name is Palad or Palhad. I've met him several times before. He used to be one of the major figures in Imperial Mages Guild. More than that, though, he was an apprentice to Archmage himself.
Then I guess Continental armies must have missed him back during original rebellion, or maybe he abandoned his master and fled.
No, I met him after the rebellion and he was just an ordinary human. But that means that
there are other ways of turning people into Frostlings, and that those created during the rebellion may not be the only ones, and that we were wrong to think this threat over for decades. Stars, damn it all. We should get this body back to camp with us and study it there. He may be dead, but we may still learn something from him. There, grab him by the legs. I'll try to lift him by the shoulders. Let's hope he won't leak out completely on the way back. Now then, 1, 2... there we go. Now, slow and steady.
I cannot believe it. He was in Melgard 2 decades ago trying to find a way to dispel Frostlands together with the rest of us. If he was working with the Frostlings then... Or maybe he was one already and was simply masking his true nature with some illusion. We have to know more. We have to... Hold on. I was going through that street mere moments ago, and these bodies were not here. They look like... Stars take me, these Frostlings were lined up against the wall and shot. And they're not even warriors. Your Highness, we have renegade soldiers dispensing their own justice around. We should find and stop them before it gets out of hand.
We will do no such thing. These men are not renegades. They are acting on my orders.
They what? Arius, what the hell are you doing?
Many things. I'm following the plan. I'm securing good relations with Krydians by fulfilling our end of the bargain. Most importantly, though, I am securing safe future for people of Metzacan by finishing what my father started. These creatures are nothing but a threat to our people, as you said yourself, and now we finally have a chance to get rid of them once and for all. We thought the rebellion was over. We were wrong, but we can bring an end to it right now.